Okay, hello. Welcome everyone. We've been live streaming on YouTube all week long. This is, where are we at? The 15th of March, 2024. It is currently 11:18 p.m. Central European Time. So those in our time zone have nothing better to do on Friday night can tune in. We hope to be very quick this evening. I just want to fill in a few gaps. Those few of you who follow us and know we tend to say we're going to be fast and tend to rant on and on, but however, the field of what we're talking about is kind of so wide that it's kind of hard to just cut off here and there. So it's the whole issue is an issue of knowing when to stop. Let's see if I can get the focus here. Track me. Hello. Can we get into focus here? Yes. No. Well, maybe it's me. Maybe I'm not sober and everything is kind of blurry to me. But however, we can go on this way. Hopefully, we're going to try and put up a little bit of text. But getting right into things, I did want to mention that last evening we were filling in gaps that we lost. We missed out on Wednesday. Very important gaps, especially reactive forces. And I have to admit that it's been a long time since I've gone through. Let's see if this camera can put me into focus here. Track me. There we go. Thank you very much. It's been a long time since I read Nietzschean philosophy by Deleuze. And picking it up again, I was really quite surprised by the force and the style of the text itself. Like, for example, for me, Bergsonianism by Deleuze, every time I've read that since the very beginning, I've read it a few times, I can really get a sense for the context, for the time, for the rhythm, this kind of, growing intensity, this growing confidence, this, growing force throughout that book. And other books are more difficult, as we have been told in comments on our podcast, the difference in repetition and Spinozan expressionism were doctorate works for Deleuze, and in the French doctorate system, it's not that you can't really develop your own style in language. However, you have to be very, very formal, and these are papers that have another tone, because that's kind of your thesis, for example. So you have to be very, very academic, and so that's, I always found Deleuze always spoke about Spinoza and how the ethics has all this changes in speed and velocity and the building up of the arguments. I don't know if you get a sense of that in French or in Latin. I doubt that. However, coming back to Deleuze's work on Nietzsche, I could really feel the strength of it, and also understand this kind of naivete on my part in looking at external relations, or I insist on using that as a Humean empiricist, forgive me, or becomings. I kind of realized my naivete, in which in this book Deleuze is saying essentially that yes, external relations are occurring constantly everywhere, but the huge majority of them fall to reactive forces, which convince the active forces to turn against us, and therefore, let's say for a pure becoming would be a becoming without reactive forces. And as we've seen yesterday, force, which is a condition of the human, and we looked into the definition of human, is necessarily a plurality. So if you have two people, you will necessarily have two forces. Those minimum, and those forces will be always plural, and the forces will form a relation with each force itself being a plurality, will seek to dominate the other forces, and a differential relationship will form, let's call it, the quality of the external relation, or the quality of the becoming. So the important point I wanted to make, we went over this last night, is that according to Nietzsche and Deleuze's reading on Nietzsche, that nihilism, ressentiment, and let's say reactive forces are absolutely a majority of the external relations which are formed with, let's say, mankind or humans, and therefore you could kind of read Deleuze once stated that when Spinoza said, well, we don't even really know what a body can do, this is perfectly aligned with Nietzsche, and Deleuze would define that as a battle cry of a philosopher. That is a cry before going into battle. We humans, defined as humans, up until now have been so dominated by nihilism, by reactive forces. Our active forces have been so limited that we still don't know what our bodies are capable of doing. And as Deleuze in his lectures stated, that's not like the Olympics. Essentially, it doesn't mean that we can run faster. No, it's a question. Bodies for Deleuze are always in relations. Also for Spinoza, also for Nietzsche, it's pluralism, a plurality. Therefore, the famous simple case with Spinoza is that when I go swimming in the ocean in its vastness, and me in my minusculeness, we form one body while I'm swimming in the ocean, and as my body adapts to the waves, the depths, and me, myself, and the ocean are one single body. So that is the pluralist war cry of Spinoza. We do not even know what a body can do. And this will echo throughout much of the work of Nietzsche, who's essentially saying we are still and have been so dominated by nihilism that we have no idea of what we are capable of doing if only our active forces could constantly prevail. So I've just done a quick text which I wanted to, just like a fly kind of flying here, beep, and filling in some of the holes we left last night. I just wanted to further this, go a little bit further with this, and also emphasize this very heavy critique. And of course, our context here is always psychology and psychoanalysis, in which I think we put a new post on our blog this evening. That's www.DeleuzeModeste.com, obviously, in which, what was the name of the post? There never was but one psychology, that of the priest. So from this point of view, we could consider in a modern capitalist world the role of the psychologist or psychoanalyst simply through other means replacing the traditional role of the priest under many centuries of rule by the church. So I'm just going to skip around here, and I just want to fix on this role of the priest, and then we can understand even further kind of the ferocity, but also the credibility of this attack by Deleuze and Guattari on Freud and psychoanalysis, as being essentially a kind of slave morality and a replacement of the priest in modern capitalist society. So I think we talked about this once on our main podcast, that in other regimes, pre-capitalist regimes with the despotic regimes, you need two figures to keep people under control. You need a king who externally keeps people under control. So if you don't pay your taxes and if you do something not in line with the order, you can be arrested, you can be killed, whatever. However, you need at the same time a plurality. You need two forces. You need a priest who will interiorize your submission to the system and your being a slave to the system, and the priest does it through interiorizing the concept of debt. So I'm just going to jump around really quick in this text here, and it's going to be a little bit random. Let's do it quick. Deleuze's reading of the genealogy, like the genealogy itself, is complex and non-linear, but his explanation of how the slave revolt fundamentally transforms human nature doesn't diverge wildly from Nietzsche's telling of the story. Some brutish type overpowers those weaker than them and violently imposes some form of social organization. This produces ressentiment among the subjugated, who cannot physically overpower their masters. But for slaves, ressentiment to become efficacious, let's say efficient, they require the help of another type, the priest. So the slave is already physically submitted, let's say, by the king or by the warriors who are physically stronger than him. But that is not efficient enough. This domination must be conquered also on an interior level. So they require the help of another type, the priest, who is the accomplice of reactive forces, but not part of them. And that is Deleuze and Gilles Deleuze and Nietzsche, page 126. Priests forge the fiction of a force separated from its expression, of a substrate endowed with volition. Upon succumbing to slave morality, masters' instincts are internalized in a manner similar to the slaves' internalization of resentment. Nietzsche calls this internalization of instincts the most fundamental of all changes humans ever experienced. So once again, this is no small or light issue. According to Friedrich Nietzsche, humans, us, if not the most important thing that ever occurred to us as humans, was the internalization of resentment. According to Nietzsche, this is the most fundamental of all changes humans ever experienced, which he compares to animals' transition from water to land, and says that this results in humans' entire inner world growing in depth, breadth, and height. So we can, for simplicity's sake, we can call our inner world the consciousness for now. And with this force of resentment, essentially brought about by the class of priests, what I'm saying is our internal world widely expanded. But in addition to producing psychological complexity, the internalization of instincts produces pain. This forms the foundation of bad conscience, which becomes guilt when coupled with an ideal of selflessness. Guilt redirects ressentiment inward, producing self-hatred. Drawing on Nietzsche's description of how memory is produced in humans through inflictions of pain, Deleuze characterizes culture in its dominant and historical sense as the continued use of pain to domesticate individuals. Humanity's retention of social norms is purchased by the infliction of various degrees and types of pain. So once again, it sounds quite pessimistic, but here the concept is that memory itself and culture itself is essentially the effect of an inscription, an interiorized inscription of pain on the self and on the consciousness. Let's see if we want to move forward here. This sketch leaves out much of the genealogy and Deleuze's analysis of it, but it suffices to motivate Deleuze's view that the slave revolt lies at the origin of the subject of interiority. So once again, we stated we should be publishing hopefully next week a podcast distilling a lot of things we've discussed on live streaming up until now. And we need to keep in mind that the foundation of modern psychoanalysis doesn't strictly begin with Freud, however, becomes enormously well-known, institutionalized, let's say, under Freud, and at the same time, Deleuze would maintain, following Nietzsche, that the actual origin of this interiority, apparently discovered by Freud and his predecessors, had already pre-existed Freud, obviously, due to the slave mentality and specifically the slave revolt. So let's go ahead really quickly. I think this was the most important part. This produces ressentiment amongst the subjugated who cannot physically overpower their masters. No, we've seen this. Hang on, let's move on. Okay, so the most overt, I'm just skipping around here, the most overt of these suggestions takes the form of a shared enemy. Deleuze and Guattari's thesis that desire is productive is a fundamental rebuke of the psychoanalytic understanding of desire as issuing from a lack. So as we have mentioned the last few evenings, with Freud, eventually Lacan, desire in Nietzschean terms, the will, is essentially defined as a lack, and similar to priests, a kind of infinite debt. It is therefore telling that they repeatedly describe psychoanalysis as priests. They claim that the most recent figure of the priest is the psychoanalyst, and insist that, as Nietzsche put it, there never was but one psychology, that of the priest. These otherwise obscure claims take on depth when read against Nietzschean philosophy, where Deleuze argues that our entire psychology belongs to ressentiment. Once again, this is kind of dark and disturbing if you follow it, if you believe that. But following Nietzsche, Deleuze is saying that our entire psychology belongs to ressentiment, to resentment. Consider parallels between priests and psychoanalysis methods. Priests convince others that the pain they experience from internalizing their instincts is evidence of their guilt. Psychoanalysts convince subjects that their psychic frustration is evidence of their unconscious desire to kill their father and sleep with their mother. Deleuze and Guattari criticized the Oedipus complex by describing it as the double direction given to ressentiment, the turning back against oneself, and the projection against the other. The father is dead. It's my fault who killed him. So very briefly, what's the double direction of ressentiment? On one hand, according to psychologists, it's a child's desire, at least a young male child's desire, to be the object of his mother's desire, to mate with his mother, and to kill his father. And Deleuze and Guattari are saying that this is a double direction because you're turning against the other, the father. I want to kill the father. And you're also turning against yourself, and then you're going to be guilty and it's your fault. No, it's my fault. Who killed him? It's your fault. So going on, they go on to write, this whole priest's psychology, there's not a single one of these tactics that does not find in Oedipus its land of milk and honey. Before describing psychoanalysis as the new avatar of the ascetic, which we can define as priestly ideal. Another parallel concerns the way priests and psychoanalysts increase others' reliance upon them. Priests appeal to the sense of guilt they create to motivate Christianity's promise of redemption. Psychoanalysts appeal to the way the libido is trapped within the family to motivate psychoanalysis's promise of psychological liberation. But just as the Christian God's self-sacrifice produces an infinite sense of guilt, this is Christ, obviously, a debt that cannot be repaid. So, psychoanalysis' notion of inexhaustible transference makes analysis interminable. That which occurred sexually in your childhood will haunt you throughout your entire life. There's no going back. Adios, muchachos, substantially. All of this is predictable insofar as as Deleuze in Nietzschean philosophy suggests the priest's fiction of a force separated from its expression forms the basis of the subject of interiority. So, I could go on. We could move on here on a philosophical side into Immanuel Kant, but I don't want to spend too much time on that. I just wanted to fill in some gaps from yesterday's streaming on reactive forces, and once again wanted to hammer home really this sense of how little we are. Not a nice way to say it, but how humanity has been through centuries of priests and internalization of guilt. Humanity has been not completely, obviously, but mostly separated from its active forces and operates in a condition of nihilism. I won't make any parallels to today, 2024, but I think the conclusions should be pretty clear. If Nietzsche in the 19th century was saying that the modern man could not even remotely be compared to the Renaissance man, think about comparing the Renaissance man to humans in 2024 with our iPhones and our social media, our TikTok obsession, and I won't get into other issues, but quite frankly, from a Nietzschean point of view, we are I'm trying to find a polite way to say it. We have been so severed from our active forces that one could ask itself, Well, I think the point is pretty clear. I don't want to be obscene, so I'm going to leave it there. And in order to finish up quickly, there was one other point from last evening that I left out, and I'm going to take a 2-minute pause and see if I can put some text up, because another thing that I realized, was that when we were talking about forces, and especially because the point of this podcast, is not really to be radical chic cool and, just run over concepts like, we really know what we're talking about, because quite honestly we don't. But one of the points of this podcast is to try and sit there and pick away and just peel away the levels of the onion until you get to the very core of it, and then you can find the simplest understanding of something in order to make it work for you, So I think when I was talking about forces, I was talking about forces being essentially transcendental, following Deleuze's constatation, following Nietzsche, that a will can only operate on another will. It cannot operate on matter. Therefore, I divided that into the transcendental and the sensory, into the virtual and the actual, and kind of placed these forces as being essentially transcendental, which I would still not deny. However, we saw also last evening that Deleuze is saying that these forces are like an essential constituent of the human itself. And a lot of these forces could be considered biological. So if you are obsessed like me with like trying to make things as pure as possible in order to understand, it can be a little bit confusing. No, what we do know for sure is that according to Deleuze and Nietzsche, a will cannot operate on matter. I gave an example. Unfortunately, like Luke Skywalker, I don't possess the Force, therefore I cannot will my lightsaber to run into my hands. So therefore, my will must act upon the will of another object, another person, let's say another. My will operates on the will of an other. And that could, in a certain sense, be conceived as a faculty, kind of like Kant's transcendental faculties. However, it gets a little bit confusing because it's also something that occurs on the biological level, and as we're about to witness, it's something not only unique to humans, but let's start by saying that the will is something that belongs to biological, or let's call it animate life. So we're going to look quickly when we get back into a text talking about Georges Bataille, and look at some clear examples of what the will is. And I don't think it's going to clear things up too much, but once again, the point of this podcast is not to tell you what things are. It's just to create a context and share information, and then if it can be useful or helpful, you will have to decide where you want to put that. So once again, I repeat, I do absolutely am not a voice of truth, far from it. But the whole point here is to just get into the richness, the context that we can call it a plane which you're populating. You call it a mood board or whatever, but just to create a kind of organism in which we have all these elements, and then anyone can kind of trace out, subtract, add, etc., etc. Dare would I call it a rhizome. But personally, I was never a huge fan of that term, rhizome. But that's just me. So we'll be back in 2 minutes, and we will take a look at some concrete examples in the physical, biological world of how one could understand the will to power with organisms which are not human. So see you in a couple of minutes and be right back. And thank you as always for your patience. Let's transition here. Okay, so here we are back. I want to see, I'm going to waste a little bit of time here, but hopefully it'll be fast the same. If I can put some of this text on our screen. I'm going to try very quickly here in OBS. What do we have? Text GDI plus. Okay. Let's see what's going to happen if I copy this from a PDF. And this is Georges Bataille, who I believe we all know, writer, French writer and poet. So what's going to happen? No, he's not copying our text. Nor is he pasting our text, so that's interesting. Hang on, let's try really quickly to open some silly program. Hello. Oh my goodness. Ha. That's terrible. Let's see. Okay, so copy paste does indeed work. My apologies, I wasn't done it before, but no, here's where my text goes. Sorry, that's my fault. Let's see if we can transition that into wrong button. Let's say okay. And let's see. Oh, I probably put that, I'm guessing. Let's try one more time. Let's add text GDI. Yes, thank you very much. Add existing. Okay. Hello. Where would text GDI be? It apparently is here. But does not want to show itself. So how can we try and fix that? Color. Let's select the color here. Okay. Opacity. Fonts, just like Arial, and it's okay. And our text does not want to cooperate, unsurprisingly, in any way, shape, or form. OBS is giving us an extremely enormous and bizarre window. What in goodness' name is this? This is really, really strange. Perhaps our font size is a little too large. 256 looks. Wow. So we can kind of see it. Let's try to drag that down. I find that terrifying. So there's our text. We seem to have completely destroyed our video. which should absolutely not be this. Let's shut that off and see if we can get a video camera back up and working. There we go. And we still have this annoying text here. Oh my goodness. Let's make one last attempt at this, huh? No. I'm not sure. Surface of the globe. Let's try and break that down. Oh, there we go. Let's try and do it this way. Well, I can't think of a more perverse and obtuse way, honestly. To do this, profit. The oh my goodness. We're getting that. My goodness, what a bloody mess. Okay. My apologies to everyone, but I think we do have this text up here. It could be better, but this is from Georges Bataille. And I repeat again, the point here was just this kind of question to really try and simplify things as much as possible, understand with some concrete examples. Now our camera's out of zoom. No thank you, no one wants to see me that close. Let's try that. Track me, please. It's going to take a while. But we are looking into a concrete definition of what is a force, which we may or may not obtain. However, with Georges Bataille, we're going to look into some examples. So the living organism in a situation determined by the play of energy of the surface of the globe ordinarily receives more energy than is necessary for maintaining life. So the plant absorbing sunlight will inevitably have an excess of energy within it. This is a surplus in Marxist terms. The excess energy can be used for the growth of a system, for example, an organism. So we assume that if there is no surplus of energy for an organism, there would be no will or no, let's say, no drive towards expanding itself. So it is once we have this excess of energy, contributes to the growth of an organism. If the system can no longer grow, or if the excess cannot be completely absorbed in its growth, it must necessarily be lost without profit. It must be spent, willingly or not, gloriously or catastrophically. So, if this excess of energy absorbed by an organism cannot be used towards growth, or it cannot be completely absorbed in, let's say, the force of its own growth, it will be lost without profit. It will be spent. The organism will not change. it will be spent, it will willingly or not die, gloriously or catastrophically. As a rule, the surface of the globe is invested by life to the extent possible. By and large, the myriad forms of life adapted to the available resources, so that space is its basic limit. Life suffocates within limits that are too close. It aspires manifold ways to an impossible growth. This atmosphere of malediction presupposes anguish, and anguish for its part signifies the absence or weakness of the pressure exerted by the exuberance of life. So once again, very Nietzschean here. There can be anguish only from a personal, particular point of view that is radically opposed to the general point of view based on the exuberance of living matter as a whole. Anguish is meaningless for someone who overflows with life, and for life as a whole, which is an overflowing by its very nature. So that is kind of a quick introduction into what we're going to be looking at. I'm not sure if you can see that all. Okay, we're going to move that over here. So, quickly reading. To place this in Bataille's picture, we should consider will to power the general bioenergetic principle of life. The generalized completeness of the extension of the biosphere in every possible direction, and the consequent necessity of an overall non-productive expenditure of energy. In this picture, no use of solar energy is possible in a generalized way, and insofar as such a use is possible in a particular instance, it is not only by displacement of necessary expenditure to a different place within the biosphere. The displacer, that individual, species, or other unit which succeeds in temporarily displacing the necessity of expenditure elsewhere, constitutes an active force. So once again, the displacer, that which displaces an organism, any biological organism, which can be an individual, species, or another unit. Let's break that down and just call it an other, which succeeds in temporarily displacing the necessity of expenditure elsewhere. For example, if I have a surplus of energy as an organism, I could also attempt to retain that energy, therefore reducing my need to actively, continually absorb energy from my environment. Think about right now in Mille Plateau, the beginnings of agriculture, the beginning of surplus, the beginning of stock, no? That stock can be considered a displacement unit, because that is a surplus which does not immediately serve the biological needs of a population, and therefore it could be viewed as a displacer in the terms of Bataille, and therefore an active force. The location of displacement, which must increase, perhaps to the point of its complete extermination, its non-productive expenditure becomes a reactive force. So, in this context, the location of displacement, meaning literally where the organism will displace itself to, this location, which must increase because the organism will increase, can put the location of the displacement to a potential extermination. If this organism is to displace itself, grow, it will necessarily exterminate that which it finds in its field of displacement. Kind of a difficult language here, but we should be able to simplify this a lot. An active force must, however, become a reactive force when it is no longer able to maintain its new degree of accumulated energy. So, what's being said here is an active force. Obviously, no need for translation here. Its source, its power, is not indefinite. It is not infinite. It is relative to its own source of accumulated energy. So, kind of a complex language, but quite simply what's being said here is that an organism will accumulate a surplus, an excess of energy, and this excess of energy could, if the excess is powerful enough, and the excess obviously is beyond the simple survival of the organism. That surplus is called a displacer, which would contribute to the organism's growth and eventual extermination if it succeeds in its own growth, if it has sufficient power of the area to which it will displace itself. Think of cells slowly growing, overcoming space. Space is specifically mentioned here. An organism is conquering space through its own internal will to power. An active force must, however, become a reactive force when it is no longer able to maintain its degree of new energy. So once this energy is expended, this active force will become reactive and quite potentially could turn against the organism itself, meaning perhaps if you had a surplus of energy and you began to grow, but you do not have sufficient energy in order to grow, you've partially grown, but once your energy is depleted, perhaps that new, larger, displaced, grown organism doesn't have enough sufficient energy to sustain itself, and therefore many parts are a reference here is like an amoeba or cells that are growing can perhaps die off, and this will be considered in this biological context a reactive force. So concretely, and let's see if I can pull off a miracle and quickly substitute this text, because this next example should be much clearer. I have no clue how OBS formats text to be sincere, and also did not know why I have to do multiple steps to import it, but whatever. What do I know? We're going to paste that. We're going to drop it in here. And then we are going to start manually formatting, which is not too much fun. However, it must be done. There we go. No, it doesn't want to format the first one, nor the second one, nor the third one, nor the fourth one. And goodness knows if this is going to be legible to anyone out there. Let's see if we can transition. Here we go. Okay, so this appears to have worked out. Let's move it up into the center here and update that. Okay, so this would be a concrete example here. Concretely, take as an example two chlorophyllc species of single-celled organisms completely covering the surface of a pond. So we have a pond and we have two chlorophyllc species, different species of single-celled organisms completely covering the surface of a pond. So once again, pluralism, we start with two. As always, one species, or call it an individual if you like, since every unit is genetically identical, can expand only at the expense of the territory covered by the other. So quite simple. Our pond is, let's say it's equally populated by two chlorophyllc species of single-celled organisms, and the pond is full and divided up. So obviously, if one wants to displace itself to grow, that will come at the expense of the other. Each species continues to absorb radiation from the sun, which brings it chemically to a state where some of its cells must either reproduce or die. If the latter, meaning to die, they dissipate the energy which they have absorbed in their mitochondria in a manner useless to the organism species. If the former, meaning if it reproduces and doesn't die, if the former, then they must cause just such a dissipation in cells of the other species. Most likely, each species becomes at the same time reactive and active. Some cells die at the same time as other cells succeed in displacing those of the other species to reproduce, though of course there may be a preponderance of domination in one direction. Even if the entire pond becomes monogenic in the struggle for dominance, will to power does not thereby disappear. It merely operates instead exclusively at the level of the individual cells. So once again, our pond, in many cases, we will have a conflict of wills, as we repeated yesterday, a will of one single-celled species and another. In certain cases, perhaps the majority of cases, both species would have some cells which will die off and therefore be occupied by the other species, and vice versa. However, you would still tend to kind of have a sort of equilibrium. So in that case, we have cells which are dying off, where we have reactive forces, and at the same time we have active forces occurring which are overcoming the reactive forces, meaning they grow and do not die. And both of these species have both active and reactive forces, which are kind of, some die off here and are being conquered by the active forces of another. Reactive forces cause some of the other to die off here, and the active forces conquer that. But in the end, generally would have a sort of equilibrium, and both species would attempt to dominate with active forces and will suffer at the hand of the reactive forces, and things in the end would kind of tend to level off. However, of course, there may be a preponderance of domination in one direction. So simply genetically or at the level of affects, one single cell species may be inherently more powerful and dominant in biological terms of the other. One species may have forces which are more susceptible to being affected. One might have dominant forces which overcome most of the reactive forces compared to the other, and that's essentially a differential between these two single cell species. Even if the entire pond becomes monogenetic in this struggle for dominance, so even if one completely, let's say, conquers the other species and conquers the entire pond, in its struggle for dominance, the will to power does not thereby disappear. It merely operates instead exclusively at the level of individual cells. So even if one species is completely killed off, the will to power still remains. It is always there. It is omnipresent. In the meantime, if it has no other, literally, if it has no other with which to attempt to dominate, it will simply act upon itself, presumably in an active way, but not necessarily. So once again, this is a biological example of the will to power, and once again, as I mentioned before, Deleuze, following Nietzsche, states that the will to power, these forces, are something inherent to the human. And I have mentioned that I do believe, perhaps incorrectly, but I'm pretty sure that in Deleuzian terms they would operate on the transcendental level, because it's wills that act upon other wills. So for all you realists out there in the crowd, open your champagne. We are absolutely not affirming realism in any sense whatsoever, but much like the later concept of microbrains in What is Philosophy, what Deleuze is saying here essentially is that single-celled organisms have a will to power, just like humans have a will to power, probably just like a tree, a living tree, has a will to power, etc., etc. So forces within the biosphere do not necessarily interact only through death, though this may be the most common result. We can also imagine two plants, for example, such as two grasses, which are in a struggle for territory, where the reduction and hence expenditure of one does not result in its death, but merely its diminution. Death is simply the most absolute form of an entirely general principle of the interaction of forces. So, I'm going to pause for just 1 minute this time and give one last example where we're going to take a step up from multicellular chlorophyll species and take a step further, looking at another example of the will to power in the animal kingdom. So, stay online, and in a couple of moments we will be talking about the eternal return of a lion. Just to throw out some concrete examples, and not leaving everything abstract for us. So, let me see if I can copy this. My goodness. See you in a couple of minutes, and thanks again for your patience. Okay, so just to close up here's our second example of the will to power, and once again, I may not be absolutely answering your questions, but it's obviously up to you. Just keep in mind that according to Aristotle, man is a rational animal, and Bergson that man possesses a nervous system like many other animals or organisms, and therefore hunger, fatigue are conditions we share with animals. So these examples of the will to power in the animal kingdom, I would maintain, are equally as applicable to mankind, even if beyond the question of brains, microbrains, etc., even if we consider man as contingently evolving into a rational animal or an animal with transcendental faculties, whichever way you want to put it. So it is what it is. Let's read this. Again, we may consider yet another biological interaction of forces. A lion eats a lamb. A lion becomes active, allowing it to act out its potential of storing a still greater quantity of energy, of biomass. While in the same event, a lamb becomes reactive, releasing non-productively its accumulated biomass or energy. This allows us to consider several additional things. First, in becoming active, a lion simultaneously increases its potential for becoming reactive and exhausts, I presume, one potential for becoming active. The very active force contains within itself the movement towards a reactive force. That is, a lion expands its biomass by eating a lamb, creating a still greater degree of stored energy to be non-productively released. So once again, as was the case with our cellular organisms, in eating an entire lamb, the lion is eating more than it needs simply to survive, and is therefore will accumulate a surplus of energy, of stored energy. Stored energy to be non-productively released. So it is accumulating more surplus energy, which can be non-productively released, meaning it can attempt to dominate over other lambs or other animals with this surplus of energy which it has accumulated. An affirmation of life is an affirmation of the movement towards death. Every moment in which will to power functions is a return to the conditions under which will to power must function. Even if our lion becomes active before it becomes reactive, it must become active in a different manner than it became active before, in relation to a different becoming reactive force. Will to power always returns, but never in the same particular forces as it has already been expressed. In this sense, there is no active being, but only becoming active, and likewise no reactive being, but only becoming reactive. The much spoken of eternal return is a return to becoming in each moment. And quite curiously, this is actually, it's not so simple, this text, but I do think this is a really excellent example, which I kind of stumbled across, of explaining the eternal return as read by Deleuze through Nietzsche, in which there's no, it's an issue of becoming active and becoming reactive. The lamb in itself is not reactive because it's weaker than the lion, just as the lion is not inherently active because it's stronger than the lamb. It depends on every case of one confronting an other. When in every time that occurs, there are always a series of relations which are active, which tend to dominate, and also a series of relations which are reactive. And this is kind of, I believe, we'll get into it further ahead, an excellent way of explaining the eternal return. It's a question of becoming active or becoming reactive, that through repetition, every time, the throw of the dice, those forces are not they're not predetermined, they're not concrete, they're not pre-existent. Every time the dice is thrown, every time the lion will encounter another animal, let's say when it's hungry, or when it has a surplus of active energy, of active forces, after consuming more than is necessary to survive. Every time, every encounter will always be not a return of the same, it will be an eternal return of becoming. With every cast of the dice, at every instance, it's an issue, always an issue of becoming, of the active and reactive forces within it. So the only thing that kind of slips away from me here, not sure if I can answer that tonight. Let's just look back really quickly. A lion expands its biomass by eating a lamb. Okay. Creating a still greater degree of stored energy to be non-productively released, as it will be eventually. An affirmation of life is an affirmation of the movement towards death. Now that is a phrase that confounds me a little bit. Every moment in which will to power functions is a return to the conditions under which will to power must function. Even if our lion becomes active before it becomes reactive, it must become active in a different manner than it came active before, in relation to a different becoming reactive force. So that part makes sense to me. Thinking very quickly here. What is confounding me is an affirmation of life is an affirmation of the movement towards death. And this would come around through reactive forces which occur when a lion would expand its biomass by eating a lamb. Let's go a little. I'm just going to scroll down here. To talk about active forces and reactive forces is always to talk about a milieu or stratum. Within a milieu, all the forces may be reactive forces, but they may only be so in relation to active forces on a stratum which grounds the stratum on which forces are exclusively reactive. So we have an example. For example, a monogenetic growth within a limited biological space is exclusively reactive on the species milieu. It does nothing but dissipate the excess of solar energy it receives. However, even this purely reactive species force becomes reactive only out of the substratic struggle of both active and reactive individuals. This is only an example. Notice, It is not intended to suggest that individuals are universally a lower or more basic level than species. It may happen at other times that exactly the reverse grounding occurs, that a purely reactive individual emerges out of the antagonism between active and reactive species, the biosphere having generally exhausted the space available to it, is as a whole entirely reactive. It may do nothing but dissipate its excess of energy. Reactive forces are everywhere triumphant, or at least, Deleuze is quoting here, meaning reactive forces are everywhere triumphant, or at least looking everywhere at once, we see nothing but reactive forces. So, once again, quite difficult, this passage. This purely reactive species force becomes reactive only out of the substratic struggle of both active and reactive individuals. This is only an example. No, this is not intended to suggest that individuals are universally a lower or more basic level than species. It may happen at other times that exactly the reverse grounding occurs, that a purely reactive individual emerges out of the antagonism between active and reactive species. To talk about active forces and reactive forces is always to talk about a milieu or stratum. So we have to understand that when we speak about forces, we must always consider their relation, and let's just say to a milieu, which is essentially the space they occupy. Within a milieu, all the forces may be reactive forces, but they may only be so in relation to active forces on a stratum, a milieu, which grounds the stratum on which forces are exclusively reactive. For example, a monogenetic growth within a limited biological space. So once again, let's define milieu as the space occupied by the organism, is exclusively reactive on the species milieu. Within a limited biological is exclusively reactive on the species milieu. It does nothing but dissipate the excess of solar energy it receives. So we must always consider the milieu, which in this case would consist primarily of reactive forces, as our organism, our monogenetic growth will grow, expand, and it will react upon its milieu, and that milieu will consist of reactive forces. However, even this purely reactive species force becomes reactive only out of the substratic struggle of both active and reactive individuals. So the milieu, once again, we have to go into presuppose we always have two things, two entities, which both have a will to power. And what is being said here is that these must be taken into consideration with the milieu, let's just say space, in which they encounter one another. A purely reactive individual emerges out of antagonism. Anyway, let me shut this down here, our text, and I noticed back here and try and get rid of our dreaded text. There we go. And I guess we have reason tomorrow night to jump back on this. As I think we did kind of capture what we were trying to capture. That is to look at concrete examples of the will to power and not just leave it as this abstract thing. I do believe that with Deleuze and Guattari, there's always a tendency desire. Well, what is desire? Is desire, sexual desire? Is desire for something? Deleuze has stated that desire is something which creates series, and desire always creates links or chains between different objects in series. But the goal here this evening and the second part was to look into concrete examples of the will to power, and our examples that we had involved grass, single-cell organisms, and a lion. This last part is insisting that the milieu must always be taken into consideration, which appears to be logical, but I think we'll probably come back one last time and try to look over this again and see if we can make a little bit of sense out of it, or determine that there's not really too much sense to it and discard it. So probably tomorrow or Sunday we'll be back, and we're going to try and hack through this passage and make the most sense as possible. We wish everyone a wonderful weekend. Hope to see you soon, and take care, everyone. Thank you. Good night.